Welcome back to Shattering Myths. Most of you know that I have written 2 books on Islam. 3 if you count the Islamic Terrorist Timeline as a book. It's about 1,000 pages of research and documentation on the history of Islamic terrorism from Muhammad to the present day. And in Prophet of Doom, it's the best documented, most comprehensive, most contextual, most chronological presentation of the 5 oldest Islamic sources, where I've taken the history of Muhammad, compiled by compiled by Tabari, and the Sirah, which is the biography of Muhammad, as it was compiled by Ibn Ishaq. And I've used those 2 chronological depictions of Muhammad's life to reorder the Quran chronologically. And so it can be better understood in the context of that place and time as we're given that information from these Islamic sources. And it presented all of that information for the world to see. It's called Prophet of Doom. It's a site that is attacked regularly by Muslims because they just like the Pakistanis, they won't tolerate the truth. The truth is the most deadly weapon that could be wielded against Islam. And that book presents Muhammad as a rapist. He conducted many, many rapes. They're well documented in the Hadith. In fact, the Quran, because it's serving Muhammad's interests, says that rape is acceptable. He stole the wife of his adopted son. It's incest. To have sex with her, that's why he stole her. Muhammad engaged in pedophilia when he was 50 years old. A 6-year-old girl was placed into his bed for him to molest. When he was 53 and she was 9, the Hadith affirm that he had sex with a 9-year-old at 53 years old. And she wasn't alone, Asia. There were many children, young children, 6 to 10 years old, that were part of his harem. Muhammad built Islam initially by kidnapping people and for ransom. That was how he financed his religion. And then he found out that he could make even more money through the slave trade by having terrorist raids and killing the men, but enslaving the children, selling the children off as slaves, and allowing his men to rape the women was how he got them to fight on his behalf. He's just a repulsive man. And so if someone were to call this show, after I have spent years of my life devoted to comprehensive documentation and research about Muhammad and have written extensively about it, and someone to call this show and say, you've used errant translations of the Tariq history, even though they are published by the State University of New York, and the translators are the world's most respected experts on Islam. That you've had an errant translation of the Sirah, when there's only one English translation of the Sirah. It's by Goulamé. It's published by I believe it's Oxford Press. That your translations of the Quran are errant, and I use the 5 most universally accepted Quran translations. I actually put them up available on the site so that you could see the 5 most acclaimed, the most respected Quran translations by the most highly regarded Arabic scholars. So those charges are nullified. That you misinterpreted the nature of Islam, and yet Prophet of Doom is the most meticulously documented presentation of the earliest source material on Islam, and it is comprised exclusively of those citations and rational commentary based upon them. So someone would say, Muhammad really wasn't a pedophile. That was all symbolic language, and that, it was normal for the time for 53-year-olds to have sex with 9-year-old girls. that Muhammad really wasn't a rapist. When they're talking about he consummated his relationship with a newly conquered slave, that, that was pretty normal for the time, and we really shouldn't consider it rape. Somebody makes any one of those charges after I've done the homework, after I've made the research available, so that someone who is making such a claim is without excuse, I'm not going to allow them to ramble on about their lies. I don't care what they think. I don't care what their opinion is. I care about the truth. And so, if someone tries to say, well, he really wasn't a pedophile because girls matured earlier during that time and a 6-year-old girl was ready to have sex with a 50-year-old man, I'm going to say, no. It's not even remotely accurate. Let's deal with the facts. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is we had a fellow call this program in the third hour yesterday. His name was Rick. He was from Charlotte in the Carolinas, and he declared himself as part of the Hebrew Roots movement. And said, I agree with much of what you said, but there's some things I disagree with. I want to deal with that because it's important. When I was asked by Adam Miller if I was a Messianic Jew, the Messianic movement and the Hebrew roots are very similar in this regard. Don't think for a moment that Rick represents any mainstream religious view. Rick's point of view is Hebrew roots. Hebrew roots and Messianic Jews are very similar. What they have done is they've blended Pauline Christianity with rabbinical Judaism. And they have created a religion that blends two false religions together as if they melded into one. So what was Rick's approach to suggesting that you ought to view Paul as someone speaking for God? Well, the first thing he said is errant translations have caused me to misinterpret what Paul said. Errant translations. So let's deal with that. And we did it yesterday, but I want to go into more depth. I want folks to understand that truth matters. Opinions don't. Religions don't. Truth is all that matters. Yes, it is true that English Bible translations are horribly errant. That is absolutely true. And it's true that there is very little agreement between the oldest manuscripts and what the Texas Receptus and now the Nestle Aland reports. There are more known discrepancies between the oldest manuscripts, the 69 codexes that have been unearthed from the late 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and early 4th century before Constantine wholesale changed the text to suit his religious interests. There are huge differences. But when it comes to Paul, we have a comprehensive presentation of his letters. There's a codex that has been found that may date as early as the late 1st century, but no later than the early 2nd century, that in some cases is within 25 to 40 years of the time of the writing. It's the closest that we have of much of anything, from the original autograph to a copy. And when one examines the contents of the earliest collection of Paul's letters, and virtually all of Paul's letters are part of this collection, one realizes that rather than that exonerating Paul, rather than the errant translations somehow making Paul look bad when he was really right on, that he was an inspired spokesperson for Yahowah and was telling the truth, a more accurate, older, more reliable text condemns Paul all the more. Now, I'm not saying that because that's my opinion. I'm saying that because I've devoted 3 years of my life to studying it. I know it. It's a fact. Rick, the excuse that you laid out first of errant translations, rather than serving your interests, actually works against you. And that's essential. It goes back to the same claim of Islam. When Muslims are told that the Quran is an overt lie because it claims to confirm the Torah, when in fact it presents information that is an approach that is the antithesis of the Torah. The Quran and the Torah are exact opposites. And yet the Quran claims that it garners its authority by having the same God inspire it, and that the message is the same, that the Quran confirms the Torah. And when you tell a Muslim that they're exact opposites, which proves that the Quran is an overt lie and that Islam is a lie, based upon that simple reasoning, the fact that they are opposites, not the same, they say, well, it's because the Torah has been corrupted. It was changed to make Muhammad look bad. But if you look at the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, copies of them, they are extraordinarily similar to what we have today. Now, it's one word in 14 that is different, and in this case, it's the exact same case as the situation regarding Paul. A more ancient, more trustworthy text, rather than making the text more compliant with the Quran, makes it more distant. In other words, the older the text, the more reliable the text, the more differentiated the Torah and prophets are from the Quran. So the argument of altered text actually works against the person that wants to exonerate either Muhammad or Paul. Now, if you're taking a position and you're saying that this is the reason that we differ on this point, and your opinion is demonstrated to be wrong, is absolutely erroneous, then you ought to admit it and say, okay, I'm sorry. I came to an errant opinion. The name of this program is Shattering Myths. It exists to shatter myths. It does not exist to promote myths. Many years ago, I was under the misconception that errant translations might have been one of the reasons that Paul is perceived as being anti-Torah. Now, if you're swallowed by religion and the Hebrew roots movement, you may not know this, but Christians know it. Virtually every Christian pastor in the world knows it. In fact, they justify it. They know that Paul annulled the Torah. They know it. They brag about it. You just Google Paul annulling the Torah, and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian sermons and articles written justifying, from the Christian perspective, Paul's argument against the Torah, his argument against what they call the Old Testament, his argument against anybody that would promote what Yahowah had to say. They know it. So one of my goals when I started the book called Questioning Paul was to verify, because I had thought maybe errant translations is the problem. But when I wrote the book, I didn't just have my own translation. I provided the Nestle Allen's interlinear translation, and I presented at least 3 other translations of every passage. Typically the Latin Vulgate, the King James Version, and a modern translation like the New Living Testament, or the New Living Bible, whatever they call it. New Living Translation, I think, is the name. And what you find is that it's not errant translations. In fact, if you get the translations more accurate, it's vastly more condemning of Paul. For one thing, the writing quality is beneath a 5th grader. It's horrible. I mean, it's just disgusting. The writing quality is absolutely horrible. It's been made to look sane. But the actual terminology that Paul used to dismiss Yahowah and his testimony is egregious. It's far worse when the translations are corrected. That's what I told Rick. But Rick couldn't process that information, so what he did is he went on to the next point. The next point was that Paul's words are misunderstood, but that is the same as the first one. They are misunderstood, but not in the way that would make them honorable, not in the way that would make them inspired. They're misunderstood because there are those who wish to make it seem as if Paul said something worthy when he didn't. And when I wrote Questioning Paul, that was the goal. I wanted to say that errant translations and misinterpretations had led Christians to the erroneous belief that Paul was annulling the Torah, that he was in opposition to God rather than being inspired by him. I went in with that mindset, but I couldn't hold that mindset because the evidence is wholly contrary to it. And having devoted 3 years to that study, and having written a 1,000-page book that provides that information for everyone at questioningpaul.com, I know the truth. And the opinion that Paul's words have been misinterpreted, I don't hold water. It's not true. He then said, that there is a basis for the renewed covenant. I said, no, there isn't. Not past tense. It hasn't been renewed. Read the only place that even speaks of a renewal of the covenant. It's Yahowah 31. And it doesn't say that the covenant has been renewed. In fact, the context shows implicitly that when it is renewed, it will be renewed upon Yahweh's return. He has not returned. It'll be renewed as part of a reconciliation between Israel and Yahudah, not amongst some Goyim Gentiles, not certainly amongst the church. And that when it is renewed, rather than Paul's perspective of it being a new covenant that is wholly separated from, that is wholly distinct from, that is the opposite of the Torah, now it says that when he renews it, he's going to renew it on the basis of incorporating a copy of the Torah into the very fabric of our lives, that God himself is going to write the Torah in our lives. That means that the whole basis of Paul's presentation is for naught. Okay, so now this individual has made 3 claims, all of which are wholly inconsistent with the facts, with evidence. But could he admit it and just say, I have been misguided, maybe I need to do some research? No. The nature of religion. They're unable to process information that is contrary to their beliefs. When Shattering Myths continues, we'll continue to discuss this because it's extraordinarily important that you know the difference between truth and myth. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. Christians know that Paul was attacking the Torah. It's obvious. And they justify his attacks of it. They hate the Torah. They hate anyone who observes the Torah. They besmirch the Torah. They agree with Paul that the Torah can't save. It's what it means to be a Christian. But you see, if you're caught in this world of 2 religions, of a blend of Messianic Judaism, of rabbinical Judaism, and Pauline Christianity, well, then you can't take that position because you're trying to uphold the Torah and uphold Paul at the same time, even though they're in complete conflict with one another. And so the Ricks of the world are in a unique position. That's not the Christian position. The Christian position is that Torah has been annulled, that Paul was right to demean it. But not the Hebrew roots movement. They want to embrace both. So the next argument, after having been wrong 3 times and not having the good character or the rational insights to say, you're right, I've been corrected on those three things. I should probably go back and do some more research. Let me do my homework and I'll get back to you. No, he did the same thing that all religious people do. They won't admit that they've been wrong. And he just said, okay, now the next thing, it's like trying to swat a mosquito. It just goes on to bite you in a different spot. The next one was, well, Paul was attacking rabbinical claims, not the Torah. Well, I had hoped that was the case. When I started writing Questioning Paul in the first edition years ago, that was the thing I hoped the most. That was the thing I wanted to be able to show, was that Paul was attacking the Talmud, the oral law, the rabbinic teachings. I'd hope that was the case, because if that's the case, then you can exonerate Paul. If that's not the case, you have to discard Paul. I mean, it's really simple. Because it's clear that Paul's letters, particularly to the Galatians and to the Romans, take dead aim against a document. Whether that document is the Torah or the Talmud, then becomes the issue. If it's the Talmud, then he's consistent with Yahushua, he's consistent with Yahowah, and Paul as well. If it's the Torah, then he's in direct opposition to Yahowah and to Yahushua, and that he is now amongst the most evil men in the world to have ever existed. And so I began systematically, what do the words say? And what you find is that any time rabbis are mentioned, Paul praises them. He talks about how he was an exceptional rabbinic student. He talks about how Gamaliel was his professor, the most acclaimed rabbi of the day. He even professes that he adhered to the traditions, which are the rabbinical traditions, their rabbinical oral law. He praises the rabbis. He even trained to be one. So rather than demeaning rabbinic teaching, which Yahowah did, and Yahushua did, Yahushua just attacked them viciously. But he made it really clear. He told us who he was attacking, and then he cited from their works and exposed and condemned what they had to say in their oral law. And he attacked them by name. It was really clear. And then Yahushua would speak of the Torah with great reverence. He would say, I'm the living embodiment of the Torah. If you want to understand me, look at the Torah. Don't think for a moment that I came to annul the Torah. And so, in this regard, Paul praises the very people and the very testimony that Yahushua condemned. Now, on the other side, when Paul is attacking, he's citing from the Torah to demean the Torah. He's clearly identifying which book and which author he is maligning, because he cites from it. And he's constantly referring to the Torah to annul the Torah. The position that he's attacking rabbinic law is absolutely nonsense. It is completely and totally inconsistent with Paul's letters. The opposite is true. He praises the rabbinic text, and he demeans in every possible way Yahowah's Torah. So the next point is not only untrue, it's the opposite of what's true. And there is no way to come to the conclusion that he has by evidence. It's only by faith. Once again, Rick, as a religious individual, was unable to process that information. Next, he says, I don't think that Paul has ever contradicted the Torah. So I shot off 3 examples. Now, there's countless examples. But if there's one example, then he's a false prophet. That's Yahowah's standard. Yahowah tells us the standard for someone who claims to speak from him. They have to be 100% consistent with his testimony, and they can never get a single prophecy wrong. One inconsistency, and that prophet becomes the plague of death. So I said, wait a minute, why don't we start here? Paul said the Torah could not save, was incapable of saving in Galatians, and Yahowah says that the Torah is the means to salvation, is the means to restoring our souls. And so Rick's comment was he knew what Paul said. He knew that Paul said the Torah couldn't save. He agreed with Paul. And so he said, well, why don't you cite something that demonstrates that Yahowah said the Torah is the means to salvation? So I cited the Psalm. And I also cited Yahowah's statement that he etched in stone, where he claimed to be our Savior based upon what he has done for us as it's recorded in the Torah. Now he was 0 for 6. Couldn't deal with any of this. So let's move on to the next one. Yahowah says that there's one covenant, and that covenant is forever. And the covenant was made between Abraham and Sarah through Yishak and Jacob. Paul says there's a second covenant. And he says that the first covenant that was created and memorialized in the Torah was of Hagar, and therefore it enslaved. When Yahowah says that Hagar was banished. And he said that Hagar's offspring, Ishmael, was absolutely and wholly excluded from the covenant. Paul's testimony regarding the covenant is the antithesis, the exact opposite of what Yahowah says. Rick couldn't deal with that. He wanted to cite some passage in Hosea that talks about God divorcing his people for their proclivity to promote the Lord's religion. Satan. Has nothing to do with it. Yahowah presents who he formed his covenant with in the first book of the Torah. The testimony there is the antithesis of what Paul wrote in Galatians. If one was lying, if one is telling the truth, the other is lying. If God is telling the truth, then Paul is lying. Even if God were lying, Paul can't be telling the truth because he claims to be inspired by him. That's a full stop moment. If you're an advocate of Paul and you recognize that his statement in Galatians regarding there being a second covenant and that the one memorialized in the Torah enslaves because it was made with Hagar, when the opposite is true, it's full stop. You can't solve that problem. Now, if you're not willing at that point to say, I guess I was wrong about Paul, then you aren't a rational individual. You aren't somebody that you can have an informed, logical discussion with. I said, so let's go on. Circumcision was Paul's cause célèbre. He said circumcision was counterproductive, that there was no reason to be circumcised. And Yahowah says that if you aren't circumcised, you cannot participate in Passover. Passover is the means to immortality, which means you cannot become immortal unless you're circumcised. Yahowah says that unless you're circumcised as the sign of the covenant, you can't engage in that family-oriented relationship with him, which means you can't be part of his family. Which means you can't receive any of the benefits of the covenant. God says in Ezekiel that if you're not circumcised, you can't enter his home. And he calls the Jewish teaching, Paul was Jewish, that uncircumcision is acceptable, as among the greatest abominations ever perpetrated by humankind. Paul's statements about circumcision are the opposite of Yahowah's statements regarding circumcision. It's game over, folks. If you're rational, if you're informed, you can't hold those positions. It means that Paul directly contradicted God while claiming to be inspired by the God that he was calling both impotent and invalid. It's irrational. Hoping that there would be some sign that Rick would be capable of a logical evaluation of the evidence and come to his senses. I said, Yahshua said that if anyone claimed to have seen him before the entire world sees him at one time, that person is a liar, don't follow them. And yet Paul made that very claim. And what did the world do? Ignored what Yahowah said and followed him. Yahowah called Paul the plague of death. Called him out by name. Said Shaul, which is his given name. He is the plague of death. Condemning him. Do you think Yahowah knows who he's talking about? Yahowah said there would be a wolf in sheep's clothing. He said that there would be a false apostle in Ephesus. There is no other candidate but Paul. That's why I challenged him. I said, if you want to find a candidate for either the wolf in sheep's clothing or the false apostle in Ephesus, have at it. Because you've got to know one. Because if one doesn't exist, then what Yahowah said was irrelevant. He was babbling about nonsense. I mean, this is his Sermon on the Mount. Its conclusion, where he tells people that I want you away from me. I don't know you Christians who call me Lord, who claim to do all of this Christian stuff. I don't know you. Get away from me because you're Torahless. And that discussion is when he calls Paul the wolf in sheep's clothing. There is no other candidate. And then you've got the false apostles of Ephesus, of which Paul and Timothy claim that role for themselves. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'm your host, Yahowah. You can participate in this discussion, 877-300-7645. It could be claimed, and maybe rightfully so, that I spoke over Rick, and I did not give Rick the opportunity to justify his claims. But I want you to think through this. Rick, on behalf of his religion, which is an amalgamation of Pauline Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, was allowed to make 5 points, all of which were invalid, all of which I negated. 6 points he was allowed to make, all of which I took the time to negate. That errant translations were the problem in making Paul look bad, when if you translated what Paul said more accurately, he wouldn't look so bad. It's not true. That Paul's words are misinterpreted. Beg to differ. That's not true. That the renewed covenant justifies this, that there is a renewed covenant. That's not true either. That Paul was attacking rabbinic claims, not the Torah. That's not true either. The opposite of that is true. That Paul was correct in saying that the Torah cannot save, so it was what he had to say was necessary. It's not true either. That Paul said that it is completed, and that he believes, therefore, in, as he said, the Mashiach, Yeshua. No. You know, there are things that Paul said that you can cite that give the perception of being true, therefore exonerating Paul. But as it's the particular statement that he quoted, it's completed. Paul himself said that he had to complete the suffering. That Yahowah was incapable of doing everything that was necessary, so that in his own body that he had to endure and complete that which God was unable to do. So even in it's completed, Paul contradicted himself. Now you can read someplace, maybe said, where Paul says, I followed the traditions of my people. Well, you don't know what the traditions of the people are. You might think that's a good thing, and you realize he's talking about his life as a rabbi. All by citing something that Paul said that appears to be consistent with the Torah. When it's inconsistent with what Paul has said elsewhere, all you're showing is that Paul internally contradicts himself, which means that he's not trustworthy. And let Rick make 6 points. All 6 were lies. It's important that you know that that's what religion does to people. He wasn't able to process any of it. You can't help a religious person. I get more letters personally to me on this one topic than anything else. Now, before I leave, Rick, let me make one concluding comment, and then we'll speak to the preponderance of the letters. There is a lure and a growing enthusiasm for Messianic Judaism, Messianic Christianity, if you will, and Hebrew roots. Don't go there. All they're doing is blending 2 lies together. Rabbinic Judaism and Pauline Christianity. Don't be a sucker for it. It's not in any way, shape, or form beneficial. The other is that generally, it's impossible to reason with a religious individual. No matter what point they make, if you systematically refute the point that they have made that is the basis of their religious belief, they won't deal with it. They can't deal with it. They just go on to the next point. Rick was a classic example. 6 different invalid points. And if we'd given him more time, he'd have made a 7th and an 8th and a 9th and a 10th and never processed, never dealt with the discord between anything that was said and his devotion to his religion. It's why you cannot help a religious individual. Evidence and reason are discarded. Even the testimony of the very God they claim to know and serve is considered anathema to them, repulsive, and it is rejected. We'll be